ME121. This week we are focusing on two chapters, Chapter 12, which concentrates on the circulation of blood and lymph, and Chapter 14, which focuses on the respiratory system. You might remember we talked about the cardiovascular system previously, and we talked about the heart, and so a lot of what we touched on in there will be reintroduced and gone over again in terms of the circulation of the blood and the lymph with a little bit more detail in terms of blood vasculature. Let's start with the blood vessels. So blood vessels are basically just tubes that deliver blood to the tissues. Pretty important role, but pretty simple when you think about it. The walls of an artery or vein have 3 layers, and they are labeled on here. They are each called tunics. So you see here we have tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica adventitia. Looking a little bit more deeply. So we have the structures and the functions of the arteries, capillaries, and the veins. Arteries carry blood from the ventricles of the heart to the tissues and organs of the body. Capillaries, these are a very important part, but very minute. They permit materials to be exchanged between the blood and the tissues. So that's where the exchange actually takes place. Veins are what conduct blood back toward the heart. Arterioles, just smaller arteries, have smooth muscles in the walls that allow it to constrict or relax, allowing it to change its radius. Arterioles and venules are connected by sinusoids in the liver, spleen, and also the bone marrow. That's important to know. In terms of lymphatics, so lymphatic vessels are all over our body. And actually, they deliver lymph to the thoracic duct from all over the body, except for the right upper quadrant, and it has a different duct that it delivers lymph into. So there are 2 large lymphatic ducts. Talking specifically about the pulmonary circulation, and we touched on this when we talked about the cardiovascular system just briefly. So blood flows through a continuous network of blood vessels that form a double circuit. That pulmonary circulation connects the heart and the lungs. The pulmonary arteries deliver blood to the lungs. So the blood going to the lungs in those arteries actually doesn't have oxygen yet. It's the only place in the body that arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. The sequence of blood flow through the pulmonary circulation is important to know. It starts at the right atrium, goes to the right ventricle, and then out through the pulmonary arteries to the pulmonary capillaries, which are located in the lungs, back to the heart in the pulmonary veins. That's the only place that veins have oxygenated blood because they just came from the lungs picking up that oxygen. And then the last part of that sequence to know is the left atrium is where the pulmonary veins enter the heart. So it is important to know that those pulmonary veins carry oxygen-enriched blood. Some of our largest vessels in our body, the aorta and the vena cavas. So we have the aorta, which is the largest artery, and we have our superior and inferior vena cavas, which is our largest vein. The aortic arch, you can see it coming off the heart here. It is in red. It curves from the ascending aorta and makes that U-turn. In terms of the vena cava, the superior vena cava receives blood from the upper portions of the body. The inferior vena cava receives blood returning from below the level of the diaphragm. Moving next, we'll just touch on our hepatic portal vein. When we hear that term hepatic, we should always associate that with the liver. So the hepatic portal vein delivers blood from the organs of the digestive system to the liver. In terms of blood pressure, so blood pressure is basically blood flow times peripheral resistance. That's good to know for your quiz. So when blood pressure decreases, Sympathetic nerves signal vasoconstriction in the blood vessels so that the pressure rises again. When blood pressure increases, special receptors called baroreceptors, and that's an important one to remember, they're present in the walls of certain arteries and in the heart wall, send messages to the cardiac centers in the medulla. Then parasympathetic nerves signal the heart to slow, and that lowers the blood pressure. So the cardiac centers also inhibit sympathetic nerves that constrict arterioles. Inhibiting those nerves lowers the blood pressure as well. When blood pressure decreases, the kidneys secrete renin, which acts on angiotensinogen. And I know that's a mouthful, and it's on here for you to help remember. So the blood pressure is increased by the reabsorption of the sodium ions in the kidneys, and as a result, more fluid is then retained. Blood volume increases, which raises blood pressure. So the key point on that last little segment, which I know was a little bit complex, low blood pressure stimulates the kidneys to release an enzyme known as renin, and that acts on the plasma protein angiotensinogen, and that word is on the last bullet point there on our slide. We're going to move next to our respiratory system. So the respiratory system, basically, we're looking at the lungs and the airway. The organs of the respiratory tract can be divided into two groups: the upper respiratory tract, generally speaking, the nose, the nasal cavities, the sinuses, and the pharynx, and the lower respiratory tract, which can be considered the larynx, trachea, bronchial tree, and the lungs. The vital link between the alveoli, which are the little tiny little grape clusters you see on this slide, and the body cells is the circulatory system. And I want to point that out because your quiz does mention it. So the vital link between the alveoli and the blood cells is the circulatory system. That's where oxygen is picked up and put into the blood. And this is showing an example of how all of our body systems rely on one another. Looking more specifically at the upper respiratory system. So air passes into the nose through its two openings, the nares, also known as nostrils. So mucus cells within the lining of the nose produce more than 1 pint of mucus a day, if you can believe that. The opening the opening into the larynx is known as the glottis, and it is not labeled on here, so I wanted you to know that. The opening into the larynx is known as the glottis. During swallowing, there is a flap of tissue known as the epiglottis, and that is labeled on here. It automatically closes off the larynx, so food cannot enter the lower airway because we do not want food into our respiratory system. So the lower respiratory system, we're talking about the trachea and the lungs. The trachea is also known as the windpipe when we're talking just common day vernacular. It has C-shaped cartilage rings. The bronchi, there's two large branches. The bronchial tree, as it starts to branch further, consists of branched mucous membrane-lined tubes leading from the trachea all the way to the alveoli, and those warm, moisten, and filter the incoming air. Bronchial constriction increases the chances that inhaled particles are trapped by mucus and do not enter the lungs. The alveoli, these are air sacs found at the end of the bronchioles. So as the bronchi get smaller, they become bronchioles. The walls of the alveoli consist of a single layer of epithelial cells and elastic fibers. That's where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air inside the alveoli and the blood from the pulmonary capillaries occurs. And that's why the walls are built so thin, because they have to allow that transfer of materials. The lungs are found in the thoracic cavity, and that's good to remember. The right lung is actually larger than the left lung. It has 3 lobes, and the left lung only has 2. There's a good reason for that. It's the placement of our heart. It takes up some real estate in our thoracic cavity, so the left lung is actually a little smaller. The cilia-propelled mucus elevator keeps foreign material out of the lungs. That's important to remember. Each lung is covered with a pleural membrane, which forms a sac enclosing the lungs and continues as the lining of the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm, which lies just below our lungs, and it's not pictured on here, is a strong dome-shaped muscle, and it is considered the floor of the thoracic cavity. Let's talk about breathing next. So, breathing is regulated by the respiratory centers in the medulla and the pons. Respiration is defined as the exchange of gases between the body and its environment. Ventilation is known as breathing. It's the movement of air in and out of the lungs, and it's composed of inspiration and expiration. Expired air has more than 100 times more carbon dioxide than air inspired from the environment, so more than the air that you're taking in. That is an important little tidbit to remember. Let's look a little more closely at oxygen and carbon dioxide. During cellular respiration, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product, and our body has to get rid of that. Hemoglobin forms a weak bond with oxygen that is transported in the blood. Carbon dioxide is transported in the blood mainly as bicarbonate ions, important to know. Chemoreceptors, this is a term to know. These are specialized receptors in the medulla and in the walls of the aorta and carotid arteries that are sensitive to changes in the atrial carbon dioxide concentration. Those are known as chemoreceptors. That, my friend, concludes the highlights of our 2 chapters this week. Definitely take the time to read the chapters in their entirety. Remember, it is chapter 12 as well as chapter 14. As always, if you have additional questions or concerns, I am always here to help you. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you and have a great week.